Hi, this video is going to look at U.S. agricultural policy history. It's the second video in a series looking at agri-food politics and policy. The previous one looking sort of more theoretically at issues involved in policy and politics. So we're going to look specifically at the U.S. context in this video. Historically, what kind of policies have been applied to agri-food issues. And we start with sort of the New Deal era. FDR, as president, sort of created a context where there was a sort of state-society partnership. We were just coming out of a depression. FDR turned the government into a partner, helping workers find jobs. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, were government programs that provided employment even where the market was weak. And many say that those policies helped pull the country out of depression. So it was in that context that some of the most progressive agricultural policies were made. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was put in place to help farmers because, especially in the 1930s, many Americans were farming. So that was a big segment of the economy. It's hard to imagine that now. Fewer than 2% of the population farm today, so it's a smaller proportion. But this was a different time and a different context. And so what the Agricultural Adjustment Act included were things like price supports, which guaranteed a minimum price that farmers would receive for their agricultural products. So it wasn't as much of a gamble. You knew you were going to get paid a certain amount of money when you planted your crops or raised your livestock, what have you. And there were also production controls used, limiting the amount that any individual farmer could produce so that the supply of agricultural products would not grow to a level that prices would begin to drop. If your basic economics, price is arrived at as we balance supply and demand. So if you hold demand constant and increase supply, price goes down. And so the idea of production controls it's basically supply control, right? To ensure that price is not undercut. So that was one of the ways in which price supports could be guaranteed. This slide shows some changes that happened over the subsequent decades. And overall, we can just sort of see an undoing of some of these pro-farmer policies. And it took a few years, but you can sort of see from 1945 to 1975 what we call the post-war era, the era following World War II, which was also a period of industrialization. Farming began losing its place in the U.S. economy, and pro-farmer policies began to go by the wayside. 1948, the Agricultural Act continued to support production controls, but price supports were reduced to about 90% of parity. So instead of being guaranteed a full payday, you were guaranteed at least 90% of your payday, which is still pretty good. So that was still a fairly supportive policy in 1948. A year later, in the Agricultural Act, permanent policy continued production controls and price supports at 90% of parity, so that was sort of reinforced. That was good news. Not quite as good, but not bad. By 1954, the Agricultural Act allowed price support levels to vary some. So now from 90, we're dropping it down to 82.5%. Right, so not as good, but you see the pattern here. We're starting to see a softening of government guarantees on agricultural prices. So farmers are starting to take more of a gamble when they plant their crops or raise their livestock. They're not guaranteed a particular price, but they're at least going to get around 80% at least of what they expect. In 1954, the Agricultural Trade and Development Act, PL 480, was passed, and that was more attuned to external issues, global trade, created export subsidies for commodities such as wheat and corn. So uh, farmers who were going to be exporting wheat and cotton crops, sorry, not corn, cotton. If you're going to be exporting wheat and cotton, you'd be receiving additional subsidies. And that began to create competition between farmers. And when we take a look at the book by Bill Winders, which grains we read previously in our course, we can see some of those tensions discussed there. 1964 Cotton Wheat Act made production controls of wheat and cotton more flexible. So those supply controls that were put in place in 1933 began to be undone. And as you can probably expect, that allows supply to grow out of control, which means price can drop essentially to very low levels due to oversupply issues. So we began to see more undoing of the kind of pro-farmer policies in 1964. In 1973, the Agricultural and Consumer Protection Act began to shift policy focus from farmer to consumer, right? So it made policies more market-oriented, and by it removed altogether the parity concept, so there were no more guarantees for farmers by 1973. You were totally taking a gamble by planting a crop or raising your livestock that you would get the price you expected to get when you sold those products. Because without price controls, you could be looking at a crisis situation where you have an oversupply and rock bottom prices for farmers. And this kind of laid a foundation for what we would see in the 1980s, which was a farm crisis. And many farmers went into debt. Many of them had lost their farms, went out of business. There was a lot of consolidation and corporatization of farming as a result. A lot of small family farms had to abandon farming because it was no longer profitable. They no longer had the support of the government, the control of the supply, or the price supports that they relied on. So that was sort of the arc, right? About a 30-year arc in the post-war era, from government that supported farmers to government that supported consumers. And from a consumer standpoint, in an urban society, the interest of consumers is essentially to have cheap food. And one of the ways you accomplish that is by having rock bottom prices paid to farmers. But while that may sound good to consumers, it's not a very sustainable model if people begin to abandon farming altogether, because it's just simply not a viable livelihood. They're not getting paid adequate amount of money. Now, Hansen tried to explain some of these policy changes, essentially pointing to the fact that farm population as a proportion of the overall population of the country began to shrink. So as a political force, lost a lot of clout. 1900 is about 30% of the population farmed. And as I said, today it's about 2%. So politicians are not as worried about pleasing farmers because they simply don't have as much of a vote. Well, because of the Electoral College, they still have sort of an outsized vote. So there's still something to be said about the farmer interest group as a political machine, but it doesn't make or break politicians the way it did in the 1900s or the 1930s. And now the emphasis is more on pleasing consumers and urban interests, which are more industrial, and those overshadow the interest of farmers. So those are kind of important demographic and economic changes that have shifted the focus of policy. From Winder's point of view, changes within agriculture itself have a lot to do with the changing policies, because corn, wheat, and cotton have very different interests. As we saw, wheat and cotton receive subsidies for exports, so they're more of a externally focused crops, right? And so with the divergent goals of different farmers, they can no longer present a unified front. So other issues related to the changing times, the world economic shifts happening in the 1970s. We began to see advanced globalization of capitalism. the 70s made wheat so profitable that controls seemed unnecessary. So when the price controls were removed, all seemed well in the beginning. The rising use of synthetic textiles, however, began to harm cotton production. So instead of using cotton, a lot of textile manufacturers were shifting to synthetic varieties or fabrics. Soybeans became replaced cotton as the top southern crop as a result and remain important today. And so together there were important technological, economic, and social changes that are hard to predict and had profound implications for policy and the effectiveness of some of the changes that were put in place in the 1970s. And as I said, laid a foundation for a farm crisis that would ensue in the 1980s when, for instance, the profitability of wheat went away. So declining farm population, the broader rural population has been shrinking as a proportion of society. So the constituencies have been sort of shifted for politicians. There's a general movement towards urban-centric policies. Uh, Urbanites and rural voters have different interests, especially rural agricultural voters. Um, and so farm policy tends to be more consumer-oriented than farmer-oriented, even though it's often framed as something that helps farmers. It's not always the case. All right, thank you.